Damien Vance stood in the middle of the busy restaurant kitchen, his sharp eyes scanning every corner. The sounds of sizzling pans, chopping knives, and hurried footsteps filled the air. The restaurant, Le Maison, was famous for its fine dining and high-class customers. Damien was the executive chef, the man in charge. He had trained in the best culinary schools, worked in famous restaurants, and now he ruled his kitchen with an iron fist. "Move faster," Damien shouted as a young cook hesitated for a second. "We don't have all night." The staff was used of his harsh words. They knew Damien was talented, but he was also demanding, impatient, and, worst of all, proud. He believed he was the best chef in the city, maybe even the world. That night, as the kitchen buzzed with activity, the restaurant's manager, Mr. Collins, walked in with a new hire. She was an elderly woman, small and thin, with silver hair neatly tied back. She wore a simple gray uniform and held her hands together. "This is Maria Estevez," Mr. Collins announced. "She's our new dishwasher." Some of the kitchen staff exchanged surprised looks. It was unusual to see someone so old working such a tiring job. Washing dishes in a restaurant like La Maison was tough. The pile of dirty plates never seemed to end, and the water was always hot. Damien barely glanced at Maria. "Just make sure she doesn't slow us down," he said coldly before turning back to his work. Maria, however, didn't seem bothered by his words. She gave a small nod and quietly walked toward the sink. Without hesitation, she rolled up her sleeves and started washing dishes. The other kitchen workers, feeling sorry for her, tried to help, but she shook her head and smiled. "I can manage," she said softly. At first, no one paid much attention to Maria. She worked silently, never complained, and stayed in her corner. But as the night went on, some of the staff noticed something unusual. Every now and then, Maria would pause and watch what the chefs were doing. She observed how they chopped vegetables, how they stirred sauces, how they plated the food. Her eyes, though old, were sharp and focused. Damien, of course, did not notice this. He was too busy giving orders and making sure everything was perfect. He was known for being a perfectionist. Any small mistake, and he would explode in anger. Near the end of the night, when the kitchen was still full of energy, Maria accidentally dropped a dish. The loud crash made everyone stop. Damien spun around, his face dark with anger. "What are you doing?" he snapped. Maria bent down slowly and picked up the broken pieces. "I'm very sorry," she said in a calm voice. Damien crossed his arms. "You're too old for this job. Maybe you should stay home and rest instead of slowing down my kitchen." The room fell silent. The staff looked at Damien, then at Maria, unsure of what would happen next. But Maria didn't get angry. She simply placed the broken pieces in the trash, washed her hands, and returned to the sink. She said nothing. Damien scoffed. "At least try not to break anything else," he muttered before walking away. But what he didn't know was that this quiet elderly woman was not just a dishwasher. She had once been someone great, someone who could teach him a lesson he would never forget. Maria continued working in the restaurant, washing dishes every night without complaint. She never argued, never got upset, and never spoke much. She was just there, doing her job quietly. Most of the kitchen staff respected her. They saw how hard she worked, how she never asked for help, and how she always finished her tasks. But Damien Vance, the head chef, barely noticed her. To him, Maria was just another worker, someone unimportant. He was too busy making sure his food was perfect, too busy shouting at his staff, and too busy trying to impress rich customers. One evening, the restaurant was especially busy. Every table was full, and the orders kept coming. The kitchen staff moved quickly, slicing, stirring, and plating food as fast as they could. The sound of sizzling pans and clanking plates filled the air. Everyone was under pressure. In the middle of all this chaos, Damien's voice rang out. "Faster, we have customers waiting," he barked. Maria, too, was working hard. The pile of dirty dishes never seemed to end. She scrubbed and rinsed as quickly as she could, but the plates kept stacking up. Her hands, wrinkled with age, moved steadily through the hot water, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't keep up. Damien suddenly turned toward her. His sharp eyes narrowed. "What is taking so long?" he demanded, marching toward the sink. Maria looked up calmly. "I'm doing my best," she said softly. Damien scoffed. "Your best isn't good enough. This is a high-class restaurant, not a retirement home." The kitchen went silent. The staff stopped what they were doing, holding their breath. They had seen Damien yell before, but this felt different. His words were harsh, unfair. Maria didn't react. She simply wiped her wet hands on her apron and continued washing. This made Damien even angrier. He expected her to apologize, to look ashamed, but she didn't. "I don't have time for slow workers," he snapped. "If you can't keep up, maybe you should quit." Maria paused for a moment. Then she turned to Damien and met his gaze. Her eyes were calm, steady, unreadable. For the first time, Damien noticed something strange about them. Something sharp, something intelligent. But before he could say anything else, Maria gave a small nod and returned to her work. The staff exchanged nervous glances. No one dared to say anything. Damien shook his head and walked away. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath. The rest of the night went on, but there was an unspoken tension in the kitchen. The staff felt uncomfortable about what had happened, but Maria acted as if nothing was wrong. She kept working, washing dishes, scrubbing pots, drying plates. But one person couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Liam, the young sous chef. He had been working at La Maison for a few months, trying to prove himself in the tough world of fine dining. He had seen Maria watching the chefs before, her eyes following their hands, her head nodding slightly when someone did something right. He had a feeling there was more to her than just an old woman washing dishes. And so, that night, when the kitchen finally closed, Liam decided to follow his curiosity. He walked over to Maria as she wiped down the sink. "You know a lot about cooking, don't you?" he asked quietly. Maria paused. For the first time that night, she smiled, just a little. "I know a few things," she said. Liam frowned. There was something mysterious about the way she said it. And for some reason, he had a feeling that Maria Estèves was not who she seemed to be. The next evening, the kitchen at La Maison was as busy as ever. The chefs moved quickly, their hands working with precision. The smell of fresh herbs, sizzling meat, and rich sauces filled the air. Plates were being prepared, checked, and sent out to the dining area. Maria was at her usual spot near the sink, washing dishes quietly. She worked at the same steady pace, never complaining, never rushing. But Liam, the young sous chef, kept glancing in her direction. He had been thinking about their short conversation the night before. Something about Maria seemed different. He had noticed how her eyes followed the chefs, how she watched every step of the cooking process. It was almost as if she wasn't just watching, she was studying. That night, he decided to pay closer attention. As he chopped vegetables for a salad, he noticed Maria watching from the corner of her eye. He hesitated for a moment, then continued dicing the cucumbers. But just as he was about to move on, he heard a soft voice behind him. "Your cuts are uneven," Maria said quietly. Liam turned, surprised. "What?" Maria nodded toward his cutting board. "Some pieces are larger than others. It will change the texture of the salad." Liam looked down. She was right. Some pieces were slightly bigger than the rest. He frowned. "How did you?" he started, but Maria had already turned back to her work, rinsing another dish. Liam shook his head and continued working. Maybe it was just a lucky guess. But then, it happened again. Later in the evening, he was making a sauce to go with one of the main dishes. As he stirred the pot, he suddenly heard Maria's voice again. "Too much heat," she murmured. Liam looked up. "What?" Maria didn't look at him. "You'll burn the garlic," she said simply. Liam blinked. He quickly lowered the heat and stirred the sauce more carefully. Sure enough, the garlic had started to brown too fast. If he had left it for a few more seconds, it would have turned bitter, ruining the whole dish. His hands tightened around the spoon. How did she know that? "Are you a chef?" he asked suddenly. Maria paused for a moment, then smiled softly. "I am a dishwasher," she said. Liam narrowed his eyes. That wasn't an answer. Over the next few days, he continued to notice little things. Maria never interfered, never gave direct advice, but whenever she spoke, she was right. She seemed to know every mistake before it happened. One night, Liam saw another chef struggling with a sauce. The taste wasn't quite right, and he was getting frustrated. Maria was watching from a distance. "You forgot the acidity," she said softly. The chef turned. "What?" Maria simply pointed at a small bowl of lemon juice sitting nearby. The chef hesitated, then sighed and added a few drops to the sauce. He tasted it again, and his eyes widened. It was perfect. The whole kitchen started noticing. The new dishwasher, the quiet old woman in the corner, seemed to know more about cooking than all of them. But how? Liam was determined to find out. A week passed, and the strange mystery of Maria continued. Every time she spoke, her advice was right. She never demanded attention, never showed off, but the kitchen staff had started to notice. Some even began to listen. But Damien Vance, the head chef, remained blind to it all. He was too busy controlling the kitchen, too busy shouting orders, too busy thinking he was the best. Then, one night, something happened that changed everything. A food critic arrives. The restaurant was already busy when the head waiter rushed into the kitchen, looking nervous. "We have a food critic in the dining room," he announced. The kitchen froze. Food critics were powerful people. A good review from them could bring fame and success. A bad review could destroy a restaurant's reputation. Damien smirked. "Perfect. He'll see why we are the best." He straightened his jacket, checked his plating station, and barked at the staff. Everything must be perfect. No mistakes. The critic ordered several dishes. The kitchen worked quickly, preparing each plate with extra care. The final dish was Damien's specialty, a delicate seafood dish with a rich, creamy sauce. He tasted the sauce and frowned. "Something's missing," he muttered. He turned to Liam. "Fix it." Liam gulped. The sauce was Damien's personal recipe. How could he change it? But before he could think, Maria spoke softly from the sink. "You need more balance," she said. Liam turned. "What?" Maria wiped her hands on a towel. "The sauce is too rich. It needs contrast." Damien overheard and scoffed. "And what would you know about it, old woman?" Maria met his gaze calmly. "Add a touch of white wine. It will bring out the flavors." Damien crossed his arms. "That's ridiculous." But Liam hesitated. Deep down, he knew Maria had never been wrong before. Taking a risk, he grabbed a small bottle of white wine and added a splash to the sauce. He stirred quickly and tasted it. His eyes widened. It was perfect. Damien saw Liam's reaction and frowned. "Give it to me." Liam nervously handed over a spoonful. Damien tasted it, expecting to hate it. But instead, his mouth opened slightly in surprise. The sauce was better. Without another word, he plated the dish and sent it to the critic. The verdict. Minutes passed. The kitchen was silent, waiting. Then the head waiter returned, smiling. The critic loved it. He said the balance of flavors was incredible. The kitchen let out a quiet cheer. Damien stood still, his mind racing. He had spent years perfecting that recipe, and yet an old dishwasher had improved it in seconds. He turned toward Maria, narrowing his eyes. "Who are you?" Maria simply smiled, then returned to her sink and kept washing dishes. But Damien wasn't done. He was going to find out the truth. Damien Vance could not stop thinking about what had happened. How had an old dishwasher known exactly what his sauce needed? How had she been so sure? It made no sense. She was just a kitchen worker, not a chef. And yet, she was right. The next night, Damien watched Maria closely. She worked quietly, washing dishes just like always. But now, he noticed something strange. Whenever a chef made a mistake, Maria would glance at them. She never said anything unless asked, but her eyes told the truth. She saw everything. Damien wasn't the only one who noticed. Liam, the young sous chef, had been watching Maria for days. He had already figured out that she was no ordinary dishwasher, but now he wanted proof. So when Damien wasn't looking, Liam approached Maria as she dried a pan. "You used to be a chef, didn't you?" he asked quietly. Maria looked at him and smiled. "Why do you say that?" Liam crossed his arms. "Because you know things. You see mistakes before they happen. You understand flavors better than any of us." Maria wiped her hands and looked thoughtful. I was many things in my life, she said, but here, I am a dishwasher. Liam frowned. That wasn't an answer. Why won't you just tell me? He asked. Maria chuckled softly. Because sometimes, it's better to let people discover the truth on their own. Just then, Damien's voice rang across the kitchen. Liam, stop wasting time and get back to work. Liam sighed and returned to his station. But now, he was more determined than ever to find out the truth. The hidden past. Later that night, after the restaurant closed, Damien sat in his office, staring at his laptop. He was curious now. Who was Maria Estevez? With a few quick searches, he started looking up her name. At first, nothing important came up, just ordinary records, nothing special. But then, he found something. An old newspaper article from over 30 years ago. The headline made his breath catch. Maria Estevez, the Queen of Flavor wins International Chef Award. Damien clicked on the article. His eyes widened as he read. Maria Estevez had once been a world-famous chef. She had owned a 5-star restaurant, written cookbooks, and won awards. Her dishes had been called perfect, her techniques revolutionary. People had traveled across the world just to taste her food. But then, she disappeared. There was no explanation, no scandal, no failure, just silence. One day, she was one of the greatest chefs in the world. The next, she was gone. Damien sat back, stunned. Maria Estevez, a legend, was washing dishes in his kitchen. How was this possible? Why would someone like her take a job as a simple dishwasher? His pride told him to be angry. How dare she work under him without telling the truth? But deep inside, another feeling started to grow: respect. For the first time in years, Damien Vance realized something shocking. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the best chef in the room. And he had a feeling Maria wasn't done surprising him yet. The next evening, Damien Vance walked into the kitchen with a different attitude. His usual arrogance was mixed with something new: curiosity. He looked toward the dishwashing station, where Maria was working as always. Her hands moved steadily, scrubbing plates, rinsing them, and placing them neatly on the drying rack. She looked calm, peaceful, like she belonged there. But Damien knew the truth now. Maria Estevez wasn't just a dishwasher. She was once a world-famous chef, a legend in the culinary world, and he needed to know why she was here. Taking a deep breath, he strode across the kitchen. The staff watched in silence as he stopped right in front of Maria. "We need to talk," Damien said firmly. Maria glanced at him, then continued washing dishes. "I am working," she replied. Damien's jaw tightened. "You don't belong here." At this, Maria paused. She slowly turned to face him, her eyes calm. "And where do I belong, Chef Vance?" Damien crossed his arms. "I know who you are," he said. "Maria Estevez, the Queen of Flavor. You were one of the greatest chefs in the world. And now, you're washing dishes in my kitchen. Why?" The staff gasped quietly. Even those who had suspected Maria was special had never imagined this. Maria sighed and dried her hands. "You did your research," she said with a small smile. Damien nodded. "I had to. It didn't make sense. A woman with your talent, why would you give it all up?" Maria hesitated. For the first time, a shadow crossed her face. She looked down at her hands, wrinkled and rough from years of hard work. Then she spoke softly. "I walked away," she said, "many years ago." Damien frowned. "But why? You were at the top." Maria took a deep breath. "Cooking was my passion, but success, fame, it became too much. The pressure, the expectations, the competition. I lost sight of why I started in the first place. The joy of cooking disappeared. One day, I realized I wasn't happy anymore, so I left." The kitchen was silent. No one had expected that answer. Liam, who had been listening closely, finally spoke. "But why come here? Why work as a dishwasher?" Maria smiled gently. "Because I still love the kitchen," she said. "I love the sounds, the smells, the energy. I may not be a chef anymore, but being here makes me feel connected. and that is enough for me." Damien stared at her, struggling to understand. He had spent his whole life trying to reach the top, trying to prove he was the best. And here was a woman who had it all, and walked away. It didn't make sense to him. But at the same time, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Humility. He cleared his throat. "You may be happy as a dishwasher," he said, "but your talent is wasted here." Maria chuckled. "You think so?" "I know so," Damien said. "You saw my mistakes before I did. You knew how to fix my sauce in seconds. I've worked my whole life to be great, and yet you just are." Maria studied him for a moment, then she nodded. "Cooking is not about ego, Chef Vance. It's about passion. If you truly love it, then you will never stop learning." Damien swallowed. For the first time, he realized he had spent so many years trying to be the best that he had forgotten to simply love the craft. And standing in front of him was someone who had mastered it, not with arrogance, but with wisdom. For the first time in his life, Damien wanted to learn, and he knew exactly who could teach him. The kitchen at La Maison buzzed with energy, but something was different. Maria Estevez, the quiet, humble dishwasher, was no longer just washing dishes. That night, Damien Vance made a decision he never thought he would make. He wanted to learn from Maria. After their conversation, he had realized something important. Maria wasn't just a better chef than him. She had a deeper understanding of food, of balance, of the heart behind cooking, and if he truly wanted to be great, he needed to put aside his pride and listen. So, before service began, Damien approached Maria again. "I need you to teach me," he said firmly. Maria raised an eyebrow. "Teach you what?" Damien exhaled. "Teach me what I don't know. Teach me how to truly understand food." A small smile formed on Maria's lips. "You already know how to cook, Chef Vance." "But not like you," he admitted. "I focus on perfection. You focus on flavor. I want to learn your way." The kitchen staff, who had gathered around, exchanged shocked glances. Their proud, stubborn head chef was asking a dishwasher to teach him. Maria studied Damien for a long moment, then nodded. "All right," she said. "Let's begin." The first lesson. Maria stepped up to one of the prep stations, where a pile of fresh ingredients lay waiting. "Cooking is about balance," she said. "It's about knowing how ingredients work together. Every dish tells a story." Damien crossed his arms. "I already know that." Maria chuckled. "Do you?" She picked up a tomato and handed it to him. "Describe this to me." Damien frowned. "It's a tomato." Maria smiled. "No, what does it taste like?" He sighed and took a bite. "It's sweet, a little tangy." Maria nodded. "Good. Now, if I asked you to enhance that flavor, what would you do?" Damien thought for a moment. "Salt." Maria handed him a small dish of salt. "Try it." He sprinkled a little on the tomato and took another bite. His eyes widened slightly. The flavor had deepened. The sweetness was stronger, the tanginess sharper. Maria smiled. "You see, cooking is about understanding flavors, not just following recipes." Damien stared at the tomato in his hand. It was such a simple lesson, yet he had never thought about it this way before. He looked at Maria with new respect. "What's next?" he asked. Maria chuckled. "Now we cook. A different kind of cooking." For the rest of the night, Maria guided Damien in ways he never expected. She didn't teach him fancy techniques or difficult recipes. Instead, she made him slow down. She made him taste every ingredient, smell every spice, feel the texture of every cut of meat and vegetable. She taught him to listen to a sizzling pan, to know when a sauce was ready just by its scent. For years, Damien had cooked with precision, but now Maria was teaching him to cook with instinct. The other chefs watched in awe. The arrogant, sharp-tongued Damien Vance was now a student, and the humble dishwasher was his master. By the end of the night, Damien had created a simple dish, a roasted vegetable medley with a delicate citrus glaze. It wasn't complex, it wasn't extravagant. But when he took the first bite, he knew it was one of the best things he had ever made. Maria smiled. "Now you are starting to understand." Damien looked at her, a strange feeling settling in his chest. For the first time in years, he didn't just feel like a chef. He felt like a true cook, and he knew this was only the beginning. Days passed, and something incredible happened at La Maison. The kitchen was no longer the same. The once strict, arrogant chef Damien Vance had changed. He no longer barked orders without listening. He no longer demanded perfection without understanding the process. Instead, he paid attention. He tasted, he observed, and most importantly, he learned. And the person who changed him the most? Maria Estevez, the humble dishwasher who was once the queen of flavor. A special invitation. One evening, after service, Damien approached Maria as she wiped down the last of the dishes. "You should be in the kitchen with us," he said, "not out here washing dishes." Maria chuckled. "I told you before, Chef Vance, I am happy here." Damien shook his head. "You don't belong behind a sink. You belong where you can teach, where people can learn from you." Maria studied him for a moment, then smiled. "And what do you suggest?" Damien took a deep breath. He had been thinking about this for days. "I want you to be our culinary mentor," he said. "Teach the chefs, share your knowledge, help us all become better." The kitchen staff, who had gathered nearby, gasped. Maria, the woman they had once ignored, was now being offered a position of honor. Maria smiled softly, but she shook her head. "I appreciate it, Damien, but I left that world a long time ago." Damien's heart sank. "But why? You could do so much here." Maria looked around the kitchen, the gleaming countertops, the bubbling pots, the chefs hard at work. Then she looked at Damien, her eyes warm. "I already have," she said. "A farewell." The next morning, Maria didn't come to work. Confused, Damien checked with the restaurant owner. To his shock, he learned that Maria had quit. No one knew where she had gone. Liam found a small note tucked away near the sink, written in Maria's neat handwriting. "Chef Vance, you have everything you need. Trust yourself, trust your passion, and never stop learning. Maria." Damien held the note in his hands, feeling a strange mix of emotions. She was gone, just like that. But this time, she hadn't disappeared without a trace. She had left behind something greater than her presence. She had left behind wisdom. The legacy lives on months past, but Maria's influence never faded. Under Damien's leadership, the kitchen at La Maison transformed. The chefs experimented more, focusing on balance and flavor rather than just technical perfection. The restaurant flourished. Customers noticed the difference. The dishes had more soul, more depth. And Damien? He was no longer just a great chef. He had become a teacher, just like Maria had wanted. One evening, as Damien prepared a dish, he tasted the sauce and frowned. Something was missing. Then he smiled. Reaching for a small bottle of white wine, he added just a splash. He stirred, tasted again, and nodded. Perfect. And somewhere, far away, Maria Estevez was smiling, knowing that her lesson had not been forgotten. Because true cooking is not about fame. It's about passion, wisdom, and the love of food. And that was a lesson Damien would carry for the rest of his life.